We often say that a good cookbook is more than just a collection of recipes. But what do we mean by more? Welcome to another episode of Everything Cookbooks, the podcast for writers, readers, and cooks. I'm Molly Stevens, and today I'm here with Andrea Nguyen. Hello, Andrea.
Hello, Miss Stevens.
I think this is something you and I have talked about probably as long as we've known each other, but what's a cookbook? A cookbook, it's more than a collection of recipes, but what does that even mean? It is a collection of recipes, but what is the more?
Right, and when we make cookbooks, sometimes more seems like more, like people put more recipes in and it seems like it's more, but the more is really in all the other words that frame and surround the recipes, right?
Right. Like I think you and I, when we say more, we want to teach. We want people to come away with skills and knowledge, but more could be a lifestyle book, or more could be, we talked about entertaining books last winter and fantasy.
Healthness, meditations, more can be all kinds of things. More can also be the photography that's in a cookbook, that's aspirational. But the recipes, for me, that make a cookbook usable can sometimes, it depends on the book, right? Some cookbooks are going to teach me some kind of technique or flavor that I don't know of. But the surprising books are sometimes the ones that just make me read more of the narrative.
Right.
That teach me something that I don't know about. And sometimes that's, a fact, a food fact.
Right.
Sometimes it's even like a vocabulary word that I don't know about that I got to look up.
Right. Or history or culture or personal stories. There are so many books. I feel like we've spoken to a lot of authors who take us on these odysseys of where food came from and the origin of recipes.
Yeah, and cookbooks can get us to think about bigger questions. So those are the books that tend to get me to read a lot more than to cook from them sometimes.
Yeah, it's interesting. I wonder too sometimes how I evaluate a cookbook's value, how I evaluate a cookbook's worth. And they say if you cook a few recipes from it over and over again, or you incorporate a few recipes into your repertoire, but books that teach me something about that, like you say, a fact or a vocabulary or culture, it's something I didn't know about that I'm going to read almost as narrative nonfiction. I care about the recipes, but I'm engaged with the prose and the essays even more, I think.
Yeah. Well, recently one of our favorite people, Jessica Harris, had, I don't know if it's her 12th or 13th cookbook published, Braided Heritage.
Right.
I've been going through the book and been so impressed by it.
Jessica is, she's been called an icon. She's Dr. Jessica B. Harris, culinary historian. She's today's guest, obviously, a storyteller, performer. She's a 40-year career as an academic. She taught at Queens College. She's in the James Beard Cookbook Hall of Fame, Lifetime Achievement Awards.
She was on Netflix, for crying out loud.
Right. High on the hog.
She's had a book made into a docuseries.
Her first book was Hot Stuff, and I think she's kind of hot stuff.
I'm really, really excited to talk to her.
Yeah, me too. I've long admired her. Let's bring her on to talk about her new book. Jessica Harris, welcome to Everything Cookbooks.
Thank you so much.
We are just beyond thrilled to have you here. But we want to jump right into your new book, Braided Heritage, with a kind of a big question. Why is Braided Heritage an important book for us now?
Ooh, so you're making me own it and take up with it. Part of it is, and it's ironic because it's not something that I was necessarily thinking of when I wrote the book. And certainly not when I wrote the book proposal. But we are in a period in our history as a nation where we're questioning, what is our nation? Who are we? Where are we from? And ironically, yet again, this is sort of my take on, I guess, one of the possible origin stories of the country. I am, as a neighbor says, a septuagenarian, which means that I learned American history very differently from other folks. And I also went to an international school, which gave me what the French would call la vue d'autrui, which means the optique, if you will, of others. I didn't go to a traditional American school, be it public or private. So with that, I kind of had to go back and think about it. What is this place that I have called home for lo these years? And it came to me, and I talk about it in the intro. It's about a tripartite story, some of which gets told, some of which gets ignored. So the idea is to step back. Then, as I say in, I think, the first chapter of the intro, it's about three. I am not young enough to have listened to Schoolhouse Rock when it was originally on, but I am a partisan, a strong partisan of Schoolhouse Rock, and even used it to teach my students when I was teaching. But the idea was three is a magic number, you know. And so to talk about three and the power of three for me as an African American woman who spent much of her youth getting her hair braided, three is about braid. And that over, under of a braid, I then looked at our history and said, First Peoples, Native Americans, the American Indian, as the museum on the mall is called, European Americans, first contact. What does that mean? How does that go badly wrong in many cases? And specifically, the Spanish, the British, the Dutch, whom we always forget, and then the descendants of the Africans who were enslaved and brought here. And that's our foundational braid. I'm not saying that's the only folks who put stuff in the pot, but I'm saying that, like the Christian Bible says, in the beginning, that's what we're kind of talking about. Then again, it's another Jessica story. It's like, oh, look at this. And I know somebody from all of those threads.
Right.
Braid. So, I got out here's a word that'll let you know I'm a septuagenarian, my Rolodex.
Right.
And looked up friends and talked to them and actually picked 11 of them from various parts of the braid, asked them for recipes and stories.
So I guess even before we get to those 11, which is their contributions are such a huge part of this, obviously, but why a cookbook, though?
You're a historian.
Well, I'm a historian by avocation.
Yes. And I have to tell you that in the introduction, you mention Evan Jones's book, American Food, The Gastronomic Story, which was published in 1974. My family got to America in 1975 when we fled Vietnam. And in the early 90s, when I was trying to beef up my food library, I bought American Food. And I opened it up and I started reading it. And I was like, this does not say much about the America I know that I identified with. It was so weird. This is in the 90s, the early 90s. And I put the book away. It was frustrating for me. And it was strange that you brought that book up because I actually sent it to Goodwill a few years ago. And because I have tried to use it as a reference book in so many ways, on and off during the years. And I was just like, it just doesn't. And so Braided Heritage, I feel, is a new book to get people into that American history of food and to answer the overall question, to quote the Talking Heads, how do we get here?
Thank you.
I was very taken by the history in there, and I see it as like this history book with recipes. Could you have written this book 20 years ago?
I am not sure. Well, I wouldn't have known Sean Sherman or John Barbary.
Right.
I would have known Renee Hunter and I would have known Julianne Vanderhoop. But the look, I think, at particularly the, if you will, indigenous food of the country, I might not have had 20 years ago. I might not have thought about 20 years ago. I would have been aware of the idea, of people being here and obviously eating, but specifically what they ate, I might not have known, although I have for more than a half a century summered on Martha's Vineyard. Martha's Vineyard is home to the Wampanoag, and the Wampanoag are people of first contact. They are the folks who were there with the Pilgrims. And so I was aware of it somewhat, but not to the degree that I think I and all of us are aware of it now. It's a different kind of thing in that way.
For anyone who hasn't seen the book yet, go get it. But
bless you.
What you're referring to, these three chapters in the Wampanoag, is the first chapter, the native peoples, the second chapter, or braid, if you will, the Europeans, and then African Americans, third chapter, third strand of this braid. And in each one of these, we have these separate, sub chapters. The point you're making, I mean, the melting pot, I think is, it's a very old, outdated metaphor for how we got here, as Andrea says, and this notion of these braids. And throughout this book, I'm fascinated by the recipes in this book, but throughout it, we have recipes that are very braided, that, your iceberg salad that brings elements of all three different. But then there's unbraided, the Sean Sherman decolonizing recipes too. And so this notion of representing what you're trying to tell, you're telling this big history story, but you're also giving us pretty simple recipes in many cases.
Yeah, I'm never going to make a turducken. Okay.
Thank God.
Yeah, I know.
Nor should you.
No, I know.
Nor should you.
Well, I'm in Louisiana, so that's why it came to mind. But the point is, I am a simple cook by affinity. Certainly, as a food historian, you look at recipes that are perhaps more complex than something you would cook for dinner or even for a special occasion. But simplicity, I think, is the real skill in some cases. The ability to do something simple well. I mean, my test of a great cook, maybe not someone running a great fancy restaurant, but a really damn good cook, is roasted chicken. How good is it? Because everything that seems simple isn't necessarily as simple to execute. So that would be me.
Going back to what you mentioned, Jessica, as your work as an African-American scholar, and many people will have learned about you through High on the Hog. In the introduction, you quote a proverb, "Until the lion speaks, tales of the hunt shall always glorify the hunter." Because English is not my native first language. I am always trying to learn proverbs. So I looked it up. Correct me if I'm wrong. It's an African proverb. Yet you didn't mention its origin, which I found to be so interesting, because you mentioned a lot of origins in the book. But I feel like it was just this really nice, generous way for you to segue into this other point that you make in that same paragraph, where you write, "Imagine world history if it were written by the vanquished, not the victors, the underlings, not the overlords, or if both were put together, then there might be an equity of experience." And that's one of the most beautiful notions in this book that I feel that comes across from beginning to end, is this aim to establish an equity of experience. How much of that equity of experience led you or motivated you from the beginning to the end of making this book?
Oh, it was always there. It's kind of a thrumming backbeat, if you will, to where I am right now. Here's a word we're not allowed to use anymore. Let's be inclusive. Let's embrace. Let's smile at each other. I'm very conscious of what a very rude friend of mine refers to as time remaining. And I would like time remaining to be gentle, to be kinder, to be warmer and not cold and, disdaining. We're all here on this spinning thing together. And it'd be a whole lot easier if we could, just get along. We don't have to love each other, but we may, and I'm sounding like the poster girl for, oh, look at her, isn't she special? But no, I just think we need to, let's reach out. Let's reach out. Decades ago, I think I was asked by Saveur magazine, what was the country that I would most like to visit? And I said Vietnam.
Oh, well.
And they sent you, not me. Well, there you go. I mean, so you actually wrote the article, but I did the preface-y thing to it. And the idea was we live in a world that's a world. My world was probably at certainly one point in time as much or more influenced by Vietnam than it was by France or possibly even some parts of the African continent, because I'm a child of that generation. And so if we start to look at all of the places that have imprinted on us, one way or the other, it becomes a different thing.
Yes, it does. And that's why I think that Molly and I both noted the fried sugar maple leaves that open up the book, the first recipe you have. In the recipe introduction, the head note, you mentioned that, hey, look at this. In Japan, they tempura fry maple leaves too. You know, as if to just say to people, this is not an isolated novel thing. It's an approach to cooking, an application of deep frying that's done in other parts of the world. But I have to tell you that it looks like a totally cool recipe, but it's kind of challenging because I have a Japanese maple, but I don't know if I want to pick it.
Well, no, and I mean, and here's the thing: it may not be a sugar maple. Japanese red maple is a different thing.
Right.
You can order sugar maple leaves online, like everything else these days, so that it's a doable recipe. If you are, up in the Northeast or in the zones where there is maple sugaring, which goes across that band of the sort of Canadian border, you got it.
It was just a striking recipe to open the book with because it's a dramatic recipe. It's nothing we've ever seen. It's one that probably, a large percentage of the people can't make as they pick up the book, but it tells this greater story as well.
Mm-hmm.
Getting to the recipes, we're sort of talking about you, Jessica, as researcher versus recipe developer. We read an interview, I think, in Garden and Gun, where you said the recipe simply becomes a locus for research. It's back to this notion of you're telling this really pretty complex, overarching history through recipes for deep fried maple leaves and iceberg salad and roast lamb and clam stew. I mean, all these really diverse range of foods. I guess the question is, are you a researcher or a recipe developer or both? And how recipes work to communicate the complicated stories you're trying to share?
It's different things, different ways, and different books, different hats, if you will. In Kwanzaa Keepsake, which just got reissued last year as a Kwanzaa Keepsake and cookbook, I'm a recipe developer. Those are my recipes. They are perhaps researched, they're perhaps taken with other things. They grow out of experience and other tastes, but they are, for the most part, things that I developed. This one is completely different because it is recipes that were given to me. These are recipes that I selected. I asked those 11 people that we referenced earlier, what recipes do you cook that are representative or do you feel would represent your tradition? And I got those recipes. And then they were tested. And that's kind of how that worked.
Jessica, the first time we met, I was teaching at New England Culinary Institute, I believe. And I think you were on tour for Iron Pots and Wooden Spoons. I have a signed copy right here.
Woohoo! Well, with something like Iron Pots and all of my kind of grand tour through the African diaspora, if you will, that's about research and reference. And I like to think it's the reason that I have way more cookbooks than any one human being should have. Books and books and books and books.
Yeah. I know. It's an obsession.
Yeah.
Brings us comfort, these books. As a side note, recently, I read an interview of Alison Roman where she said that she had moved to a small residence and she downsized to a very limited number of cookbooks, like under 100. Ooh. And I thought to myself, I do not know if or how I would ever do that because these books mean so much to me. I mean, I know I have not cooked from every single one of them, but I have cooked 2 recipes from Braided Heritage, Jessica.
Okay.
I have not read every single one of them, but I do use them. They bring me a lot of comfort and joy, as does your book. And your book is different than typical cookbooks where, people select recipes, authors select recipes because sometimes the chef wants to flex their muscles. Sometimes we want to teach a particular technique, but you're teaching something else. So Molly and I were curious as to how did you curate the list of 11 folks to include and then select the recipes that you did after they submitted them to you?
Well, the folks were, probably with the exception of 1 or 2, close and very dear friends. I knew I wanted the braid. I knew I wanted the braid to represent a variety of folks from the various constituencies. For the Native Americans, I think first contact people were, to me, kind of important. That place where things started and went well or went badly, depending on whose point of view. So Julie was a no-brainer. Renee was a no-brainer. I spend a fair amount of time on the Gulf Coast, and I actually didn't know John Barbary. He is one of the 2 people who was somebody I met through the book. And I met him because Jazz and Heritage Festival down here, Jazz Fest, he speaks. He is literally, I think each of the individuals in the book have a subhead or a title that I gave them. And he's like culture bearer because he is cultural warrior, because he is actually fighting to maintain his culture. And I think that that's so worthy of praise outside of just the region, but in a larger constituency. And then Sean Sherman, who I knew but I didn't know particularly well, was a logical 4th choice. And for the limits of pages and my poor addled brain, it was 4 out of each section to talk about the braid. Then with the Europeans, the Spanish, I had been on the advisory board when the Culinary Institute of America established its San Antonio campus and met Milisaguera. You don't forget her if you meet her. She's 6 foot tall. She's kind of rangy. She's got Texas all over her.
Yeah, your description of her brought her to life.
Yeah, it's Spanish Texas. And so it's a very different thing. And she loves it. She celebrates it. She reminds us of just how close this braided thing is. And then when she talks about her Irish antecedents, it was fascinating because I remember, and this is something that I've learned since the book was published, the Irish were invited into Texas because they were Catholic. And so it was the Spaniards, there you go, that's the look. It was the Spaniards inviting other Roman Catholics to be with them in that place, in that, for want of a better term, adventure. And so then it grows out of that. So you get all of that as well. So theoretically, while she is certainly in the book as Spanish, there's a little twist Irish in there, which already starts to braid the braid.
Right. Reinforces the whole story.
Exactly. The notorious KIT.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Amazing.
Another character.
Well, I mean, my theory is if they're crazy, I know them because it takes crazy to know crazy. So I enjoy my characters.
But you're choosing characters, people who are also going to be able to bring recipes too.
Oh, absolutely. Everyone chosen was someone who cooked, who had expertise in one way or the other. But in most cases, many cases, I won't say all cases, at whose tables I have sat. So when I go to Charleston, I stay with the person who's subhead, if you will, is the notorious KIT. And so that's how I know her, and that's how I know she cooks, and cooks out of her heritage. She is I believe it's 2N2T Bennett out of Charleston, and that means something in Charleston. It doesn't necessarily mean anything to anybody else. when we first met, I asked her how long had her people been in Charleston. She sort of laconically said, since dirt. Not quite true, but
Yeah. Yeah.
it speaks to the longevity of her family in that particular place. The other person that I didn't know, but who has become a dear person to me, is Peter Rose. Peter Rose, many people aren't familiar with, but she is the person of note for the culinary history of the Dutch in New Netherland. So she was just extraordinary and incredibly generous.
And she's written a cookbook as well.
She's written several cookbooks and several books and is just a walking testimonial to that history. The fourth person is Louis Costa, who is from New Orleans. I knew he had, shall we say, august antecedents, but in the discussion discovered that he is a direct descendant of the second male child born in the French colonies. Now, only somebody in New Orleans would know that. And then he can tell you, and that's because the first one died. And so there it is. But that's New Orleans. He absolutely lives to cook and has recipe cards from his mother and his mother's mother. So has a walking history of his family and their food in New Orleans. So that was the last of the European Americans, if you will. For African Americans, I tried a different tack because origin stories are, if available, extraordinarily complex. And so the idea is, what do you do? And so what I did was I took threads and trends. So there's migration, there's innovation, there is a friend whose family had no Southern links, which I thought was interesting because we so connect African American food with the South and the history of the South. Then the fourth African American is me. So that's kind of how it works.
And you have the more recipes than anyone else for obvious reasons.
Yeah, no, I kind of did a lean into my own stuff with my recipes. So for migration, it's Lenny Sorensen, who was for many years the African American culinary person in residence at Monticello. Then for innovation, it was Charlotte Lyons, who for more than 25 years was the food editor of Ebony, and I tasked her with taking traditional African American recipes and doing a spin on them. And then for the person who lived only in the Northeast, and this is my one great sorrow, it was Abigail Rosen McGrath. And unfortunately, Abigail died before the book was published, so she never got to see it. But her sons have seen it and embraced it. So I'm saddened but joyful that it's a way of remembering her. And then there's me.
Right. And your essays are essays where you describe each of these individuals or characters your choice to do it in your words, sort of reportage and tell their stories, as opposed to have them tell their own stories, really ties it all together. I don't know that I expected it to be different, but it has a singular voice, yet you have all these different people contributing to it. So it's something as a cookbook. When we put together cookbooks, I think we often so worry about, do I have enough appetizers and enough soups and enough biscuits or whatever it is. And as I went through this book, I wasn't missing that. I wasn't thinking, I've seen too many, because it really runs the gamut. You have salads, you have soups, you have stews, that lamb roast I'm dying to make. There's sweets, desserts, cookies, but sort of all braided together, if you will.
Thank you. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
The recipes were as they gave them. I didn't prod them. I need you to give me 5 appetizers or 3, whatevers. But there's a little something from each of the, if you will, food categories in there. You can make a meal or 2 or 3.
But you wrote all the head notes, Jessica. You wrote the head notes, and throughout you use the head notes to teach us even more. A few times, if I just jumped into the book and didn't know whose section I was in, I wouldn't necessarily say, this is Peter Rose's recipe. But then as I'm reading your head note, you're telling me a little bit something about the Dutch influence on our American foodways. So it's sort of tricky in a good way, the way you slip in even more information?
Well, it was more like you're in the kitchen with us. It's very interesting because Molly and I have met you in person and we know you and you know us. And for example, I made the stewed turnips and potatoes with pork because I love pork and turnips like you do. And you state that you're a card-carrying porcine lover or something like that. And those two ingredients, pork and turnips, go very well together in Vietnamese cooking as well. But I made that. And then for some reason, I was so taken by those Johnny cakes because I love hoe cakes. And so I had to make that. And I don't know, I just put it together on a plate for dinner with some greens and it was delicious. Mm-hmm. But it was kind of like this way of traveling through a cookbook, because when we write cookbooks, we have the story arc that we want to lead the cook and reader from beginning to the end. And we have a certain logic in mind, a certain MO, modus operandi. But as Molly mentions, like here, we're just kind of like in this very fluid state with the recipe placement and the stories. And it's a very interesting, unusual, and wonderful experience. So I guess our question is, how strategic was that in your putting the book together?
I honestly don't think it was strategic at all.
It's all right. It's the magic. It's the magic.
Yeah, it was just that. I think it was the magic. I think it was the story told itself. The story told itself, and the stories told themselves in funny ways. I mean, the way that there is a fricassee into different areas. There is Lenny's fricassee, and then there's John Barbry's. And that's interesting because Lenny's migration story involves Louisiana, where John Barbry is from. So you begin to see how these things twist and braid and come together. I hadn't thought of that either, but I mean, I think that is just perhaps the proof, if you will, of the validity of the braid, is that, you can see this happening.
And you as author make those connections as you're developing your own manuscript and help us see those connections as well. How long did the book take you? If I may ask.
It was referred by me among my friends as the book that wouldn't die, It was proposed and started before COVID. And during COVID, my main goal was to stay alive. Writing a cookbook was nowhere in my ken or my ability at that point in time. Those are 2 years that just dropped out of the equation. And then, it was long-ish, not impossibly long. They didn't beat me up too much. And Francis Lamb was my editor, so Francis is quite capable of beating people up. But I think I managed to slide in with fair grace. We moved through. So it took a while. But it was in the process.
No, it's understandable that it took a while because it reads that way. It has a texture to it that you don't get just by sitting down and starting at the beginning and going to the end. Sort of pulling back a little bit, I think we think of you as a food activist, a food historian. You talk about food politics. During your long career, what are your strategies for engaging people to think about America's complicated and often troubled past? How do you develop these strategies?
Yeesh. That is assuming that there is a strategy. I'm not sure. I just, I'm somebody with a big mouth. I've always been, and as I slide toward being an octogenarian, I'm fascinated by history, by what we limit ourselves with. And maybe it's a wider vision. Maybe it's a less tight world. And so I think that's part of it. In terms of strategy, I think anybody who knows me knows I tend to call it like I see it. And sometimes that's not necessarily politically correct. I like to hope I'm always kind. I suspect there are moments when I am a little less kind than I would like to be, but I try to be kind. That's kind of it.
But cookbooks, a number of years ago, there was like these discussions like, you shouldn't be political with cookbooks and politics has no place in a cookbook. So there's this notion of like, cookbooks ought to be nice. We've had a discussion about like cookbooks that focus on entertaining and lifestyles and stuff. You have a book here that uses words like contentious history. And I think that you have a way of making people feel more comfortable in discussing the uncomfortable. And I guess that we're in a point in America where we need to figure out strategies for talking to one another about uncomfortable, complex things, because hopefully that leads to better agreement in this, or some understanding, not even agreement.
I think several things there. I think, first of all, the table is a perfect locus for communication. Peace treaties are usually signed around tables for a reason. There is something about that makes for a different form of communication. People like to say food isn't political. Nothing is more political than food because there are people who have it and people who don't. That's ultimately very political. You can skirt it, you can, beat it up, you can put it underground, but that is the bottom line. Food is always political. Maybe not political in the way people think of it as politics, but everything about it, from the agriculture that has become agribusiness to the cultural practices that enable X to happen and Y not to happen, all of that. There's probably few things more political than food, given that the human condition is such that if you don't eat, you die. So we are all involved with food, whether we want to be or not.
And did you find it difficult to put all of that history and politics into a book that's also relatively easy to digest? I mean, this is the thing, in the introduction to the Europeans chapter, I loved all that history. And we get to Charleston, and when you explain, well, look, if you've got plantations in Charleston, you're going to have plantations in the Caribbean, and you're going to be, having plantations that grow long staple cotton and sugarcane. And I happen to have been down in Charleston last year and visited a plantation that cultivated cotton in the Sea Islands. And it was like, yeah, that totally makes sense. And that assumes a lot about your readers. You also make some points in there about American knowledge of our own history, too, that you make very pointed comments. Who is the target reader, ideally?
I'd never forget that I spent 50, that would be 50 years as an academic, not teaching history. I started out teaching French and then went to teaching kind of English as a second language almost, but freshman English courses. I realized that, Americans have pretty much one date, maybe two. The one date is 1492. It's the date we got. That we don't necessarily know 1776, but most of us have 1492. And other dates get lost in the fog. And I am not somebody who's got a ton of dates myself. So part of the fun, if you will, of researching the book was the history I learned. The connections among the varying, certainly European groups, how that worked, how parts of the American Constitution are built on the traditions of Native peoples and their systems of governance. We can be some pretty historically ignorant folk, and myself among them. I'm not pointing the finger at anybody. And so it was interesting to be able to take, and it's not a deep dive. It's just, as I said when I wrote High on the Hog, this is the tip of a very big iceberg, and I'm not trying to hit the iceberg or encapsulate the iceberg. This is just my take on a way in. And, it's already been in some ways, I can't say superseded, but been confirmed by, Same publisher, same editor, Sean Sherman's Turtle Island, which is now doing a deeper dive into Native American culinary practice than had been available before. So all of this is coming around.
Yeah. Back to, I think, what we talked about at the very beginning, and that this book couldn't have been written 20 years ago, or I don't know how it could have been received, because, now there is Sean Sherman's book. There is the new Ken Russell look at the revolution. There are things where people are starting to understand that 1492 is not the only date. There's a lot of other stuff that needs to be understood and is more becoming, not quite lingua franca, but we're getting more used to understanding the more complicated, bigger history.
Well, getting back to 1492, though, you make this point in the book that 1492 was when the Spaniards kicked the Moors out. And when I read that, I was like, it makes so much sense, because I have wondered how those ingredients got to Spain.
Yeah. And for 700 years, Spain was occupied by the Moors, who didn't come from some strange place in the Middle East, but who came from North Africa, across the Straits of Gibraltar, from where, if you go to Gibraltar, you can see Morocco. And so you've got all of that going on. You've got all of those things. And not only, was Spain Moorish, it was Moorish for 700 years. That's a long time. That's almost 3 times as long as the United States has existed. So imagine how those cultures braided or twisted or whatever you want to call it, and how that happened. So you get just a different sense of this kind of European thing when you think of that date in both looking at Europe and then looking across the Atlantic.
Now that the book is out and you've been out promoting it and seeing people's reactions, what does the American braid mean to you, and has it changed?
I am, kind of delighted that people are, for want of a better term, embracing the idea of the braid as perhaps a possible American origins, the United Statesian, because you're American if you're from Brazil or Colombia or wherever. And I think I say in the book, continent named for Italian explorer. Let's think about that. But the whole idea is that ability to just embrace it.
You expressed that beautifully. Getting back to food as politics and activism, I think that those notions are important for the new generation of food writers and chefs. What kind of advice, looking back on your very long career, Jessica, do you have for this upcoming generation?
Well, I think 2 things. First of all, activism has become a buzzword. You meet no one today who's not an activist. I don't think we're all nearly as active as we think we are. Activist used to be a term that others applied to you. It was in my knowing of it in a time when there were some serious activists. It was a term others applied to you. It was never a term you claimed for yourself. In fact, today, I think, Andrea, earlier on, you called me an activist, and there was a kind of mental what that I almost felt, because I don't know that I feel I'm active enough to be an activist. Activists, to me, are not simply doers. They're fighters. They're warriors in another kind of way. I am learning, because I'm not aware. People keep saying, don't you know who you are? It's like, no, and I don't want to. You're an icon. It's like, no, I'm not. Not to me. Because I think that when you start to do stuff like that, you then start to use it. You can be waiting for your whatever it is that you expect to be coming. I'm not an icon to me. Trust and believe I know everything that's wrong with me. I am not as active as I might want to be, and perhaps not as active as I hope to be before I go away from here. But I'll have to think about your application of that term to me.
This is how I think about it, Jessica. I think that I called you an activist, and I thought about that very deeply, Because for me, and I agree with you, and I don't call myself an activist. I don't call myself an icon or a legend, though people have deemed that to my face. I think of you as an activist because I believe in the notion of soft power, too. I see your activism. I read your activism. I've heard your activism. I've seen your activism in your work, in your whole body of work, in its complexity, and it's multidimensional, it's multimedia. And that to me is soft power, and that's built up over a lifetime. So whether or not you want it, you don't have to own it, Jessica. But to me, you wholeheartedly deserve that labeling. And I don't like labels.
Well, there you go. I think, we sit astride the same crazy. I thank you. I thank you for the definition. I thank you for the clarity. And I thank you for the notion of soft power. That I will claim.
Yeah. Well, we thank you for being here today, and through your work, your body of work, and the level at which it has engaged so many readers and thinkers. And to me, that speaks to Andrea's use of the term activist, because it certainly informed my thinking on American foodways. And I'm grateful for that, and grateful for you spending time with us.
Thank you so much.
Grateful that you wanted me. Thank you, ladies.
Thank you for listening to Everything Cookbooks. For more about each episode, subscribe to our newsletter at everythingcookbooks.substack.com. Here are some other ways to support the show. Go to everythingcookbooks.com and check out our totes, t-shirts, sweatshirts, and other merch, or just buy us around a coffee. You can also leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Thank you, as always, to our editor, Abby Circatella. And until next time, keep on writing, reading, and cooking.